Not every game of Alireza Firouzja's is a smooth win from beginning to end. Sometimes these games have real drama, in Act 1, in Act 2, and in Act 3. And it's how Firouzja plays in all phases of the game, fighting through tough resistance that is evidence of his greatness as a player. In this game against the elite Super Grandmaster Leinier Dominguez, he has such a game where he really has to struggle from beginning to end. This was played in the NIC Classic preliminaries. This is a rapid game, 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Firouzja has the white pieces. Let's begin. He plays d4 after d5 knight f3 knight f6, bishop f4. He's a real master of the London system and plays it in all of its forms, the traditional, the Jobava London, and he's playing the traditional London in this game. e6, knight b to d2, c5 attacking the center, e3, queen to b6. Dominguez hits the b2 pawn and puts some extra pressure on the center, so Firouzja just plays rook to b1, defending b2. Now bishop to d6 to directly challenge the bishop on f4. Firouzja just goes ahead and plays c3. He's okay with the exchange of the bishops if bishop f4, ef4, cd4, knight d4, and it's still an equal position, but a playable one, and he has some extra control of the central dark squares. But instead, Dominguez takes on d4, and now Firouzja plays a novelty already at move 8. Bishop takes d6. Dominguez could just take it with the queen, but then after ed4, Firouzja has a very comfortable position in this Carlsbad structure. Just bishop to d3, castles, knight to e5. It's a fairly easy to play position. So Dominguez, being a very strong player, seeing this, decides to complicate matters with an in-between move. He plays de3. So now he's attacking the bishop, but also the knight on d2. The bishop moves back to a3, and what it does, it controls the f8 square, making it illegal for black to castle kingside. It's an important diagonal, and the dark square bishop has no opponent. ed2 check, queen d2. So black has won a pawn, but cannot castle kingside for the moment. On the whole, and Firouzja has the two bishops, on the whole, Dominguez is better here. The Firouzja doesn't quite have enough compensation for a pawn, but it's close. Dominguez plays knight to e4, hitting the queen, knight e2, knight a6. Firouzja plays knight to d4. Perhaps a better move was bishop to d3, immediately threatening that knight at e4. But he plays knight to d4, bishop to d7, now f3. Kicks that knight out. That knight on e4 was well placed. The knight moves to d6. It does block the bishop, so he could castle kingside if he wanted to. Firouzja plays queen to f2, and Dominguez plays e5. A strong move, gaining space in the center with tempo. And that central structure of Dominguez becomes really the most important thing in the game. It's all about these two pawns on e5 and d5 moving forward. Firouzja could just play knight to c2, which would be a perfectly good move, but he likes to complicate matters, make his opponent think. He plays this move, knight to e6, which looks spectacular. It looks like he's just losing a piece, but he doesn't. Dominguez could take queen to f2 check, king f2, and then take the knight, but then the knight on d6 just hangs, and Firouzja regains the piece. What he does instead after knight to e6 is he goes ahead and takes the knight first, forcing the exchange of queens, pawn takes queen, then bishop to d6. So white regains his piece, white still has the two bishops, and Dominguez is still up a pawn. The move order created weaknesses here on b7 and b6, but actually that aids black because it gives Dominguez his rook at a8 the open a file, and also gives his knight at a6 access to the c5 square. So this structure actually is preferable to the healthier structure, strange as it may seem. But Dominguez has to defend the e5 pawn now, which he does with f6. And now, as I said, that central structure is everything. Firouzja goes right after it with the move f4. Dominguez could play e4 here and still be okay. He decides to castle long, attacking the bishop. Firouzja takes, pawn takes, and the pawn at e5, it looks like Firouzja can just take it. It's actually poisoned. Dominguez set a little trap. If Firouzja takes the pawn, then bishop to f5, attacks the rook at b1, and when that rook moves, rook h to e8 pins the bishop and would win the bishop and the game. So Firouzja plays bishop to e7 instead, rook to d7, bishop h4, knight to c5, bishop b5. He's got the two bishops. He's harassing his opponent's pieces. The rook has to move. Rook f1, king f1, rook f8, king to g1. And so far, Dominguez has continued to keep his advantage. And the right move for him to play in this position is king to c7. And the idea is that king is going to move up to d6 and help keep those two pawns in shape. If he keeps the pawns, he's better. If something happens, he's not. But instead, he plays bishop to d7. He would love for that bishop to trade off, have the advantage of the two bishops evaporate. So Firouzja protects it, keeps that advantage. Now, Dominguez plays knight to e6. He should have played, again, king to c7 with the same idea of going to d6. After knight e6, the position is now equal because Firouzja is able to put enough pressure on this center to equalize. He begins with rook to e1, forcing the move e4, and now c4. That undermines the central structure. Dominguez plays bishop to c6 to defend it, and I love this next move. Singular focus, b4, threatening b5 to push the bishop away from the defense of the center. And pawn has to be taken. Now bishop c4. Now the beautiful center at d5 and e5 is evaporated, and it's gone. Knight to c7, a4. He wants to play b5 and gain some space, so basically Dominguez decides to take on a4 and then rook to e4, and then rook e8, offering a trade of rooks. So we look at the position. Dominguez still has his pawn, although it's quite weak, these doubled b6 and b7 pawns. Firouzja has the two bishops as compensation. It's just an equal position, and Firouzja could have exchanged rooks, and probably it would have been a draw, but he decides to play on. He knows when a player has an advantage for a long time and then loses it, there's a real chance they're going to make a mistake. So he says, I'm going to play on. Plays rook to f4, aiming for the 7th rank. Bishop to c6, bishop to d3, hitting that pawn, so the pawn moves. Now rook to f7, jumping into the 7th rank, and his aggression pays off. Dominguez in this position should have probably played g5 or knight to e6, defending the g7 pawn. Instead, he plays bishop to d7 and loses the g-pawn. And once he loses that g-pawn, he's now in big trouble. Firouzja gets to capture the g7 pawn. And now Alireza has a winning advantage, having fought back from a bad position to an equal position, now a winning position with the two bishops and this 2-to-1 pawn majority on the king side. Dominguez plays b5, rook h7 going after the h-pawn, rook e3, rook h8 check, knight e8, bishop to g6, applying some pressure to the e8 knight, bishop to c6, aiming at this g2 pawn. But now the rook can take on h6. Now Alireza has both kingside pawns. Dominguez goes after g2, but now bishop f2 blocks the rook's access to the square. The knight goes to d6, bishop to h5 hits the rook, rook d2, bishop g4 check, king to d8, and now h4. Firouzja's pawns begin to march. Knight to e4, hitting the bishop at f2. The bishop goes to b6 with check, king to e7, now bishop to f3, with the threat of rook takes bishop, followed by bishop takes knight, getting the two minor pieces for the rook. So Dominguez defends the bishop with the rook. Rook to g6, clearing the way for the pawn to advance. King to f7, h5 protects the rook. Knight to d2, trying to pile on to the f3 bishop. Bishop c6, pawn takes, bishop d4. Notice that this bishop is aiming at the potential queening square of the h-pawn. Rook to c4 hits the bishop, rook g7 check, king f8, rook back to g4 to defend the bishop, and now knight to b3. And it looks like black is threatening to win the bishop because of a pin. It actually isn't really much of a pin. Firouzja could get out of it easy with a series of checks from the rook or the bishop. But he says, forget that. You can have the bishop. My h-pawn is just too fast. He plays h6. Rook takes bishop, and look, h7. There's just nothing Dominguez can do. Rook takes g4, h8 queen, and the game is resolved. You see the rook and the knight are far apart from each other. And Firouzja, through a series of checks, is going to win a piece. The king goes to e7, now queen e5. And the king cannot move to this f-file because he'd lose the rook. For example, king to f7, queen to f5, check, double attack, king and rook. So he plays king to d8, but then queen to d6 check. And either place the king goes, c8 or e8, Firouzja would check at e6, pick up the rook, and the game is over. So we see the fighting spirit of Alireza Firouzja in this game, from a bad position to an equal position to a winning position. Pretty exciting stuff. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.